All right. Good evening and happy Black History Month, all. My name is Sheila Boston, and I am the proud president of the New York City Bar Association, AKA the Bar of Hope. Welcome to our program entitled Critical Race Theory, Finding Hope in the Midst of Misinformation. And I hope that each one of you under the sound of my voice is healthy in both mind and body, and that you're doing all you need to do to find joy and be productive in these very challenging times. As most members of the City Bar know, mental health and wellness is one of the 6 main pillars of my presidency and the Bar of Hope. And to that end, if I may just be totally transparent with all of you this evening, there are 2 main issues keeping me up at night these days and trying to interfere with my mental health and wellness. One of those issues dovetails with another pillar of the City Bar, and that is the protection of the rule of law. And it is why I have been so outspoken against the restriction of voting rights, and why I'm so indebted to and proud of City Bar committees, such as the Rule of Law Task Force and the Elections Committee, as they've been vigilant, dedicated, and quite frankly, impactful with their programming and calls to action when it comes to the protection of voting rights and the rule of law. Now, that other topic that's been keeping me up at night recently is none other than the national uproar over CRT, critical race theory, a concept I first heard and learned about during my first year at Columbia Law School, where one of the most renowned CRT experts, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, teaches. And in fact, I took a seminar taught by her at Columbia Law that was about the intersectionality of race and gender. And it was a course that felt like a breath of fresh air to me. I mean, I really felt at home, meaning that I felt heard and understood. That is, my struggles, if you will, as a Black woman in the law profession and as a Black woman living in the United States of America. I was finally learning more about and hearing my voice, learning more about my lived experience and a part of American history that I not too often heard about in a classroom as a child. I was a public policy major at Princeton University, but was blessed to have a concentration in African American studies. Moreover, I was blessed to grow up in a home where my parents taught me via books, films, TV shows, plays, and other forms of pedagogy about Black history. I'm the product of the Prince George's County, Maryland public school system. It was a wonderful education that I received, but I cannot honestly say that we learned an awful lot about Black history. Now, things have progressed since my elementary, middle school, and high school days long ago. Well, at least that is until recently, in my humble opinion. There's a lot of talk about addressing systemic racism and engaging in anti-racism these days, but I'd submit to you, if we are serious about attaining such goals in our nation, then it is vital that all of us understand Black history is a part of American history. And thus, I'll profess to you that I believe issues concerning race and national origin should be addressed thoughtfully and age appropriately in the public school systems across our nation. I know that there are those who feel differently about this issue. And sometimes they proffer a concern about white students being made to feel guilty. And it is not a concern I take lightly. However, in the same vein, I must offer another perspective. What about the concern for the treatment and feelings of otherness, and sometimes even inferiority of students of color? Conditions to which Black students have been subjected in this country for over 400 years. So yes, I'm being totally vulnerable with all of you today and sharing my thoughts on what I believe is a very important issue we need to discuss and with which we must wrestle as a nation. Now, let me also say, I'm very much aware this topic is a hot button political issue. And most people seem to divide on politically partisan lines when it comes to this national debate on CRT and what should and should not be read and taught in schools. Frankly, it just breaks my heart. But I do not believe that we as a bar association should or can shy away from this challenging topic, especially since CRT originates from our own academicians. And since some of these battles may end up in court, argued and decided by our fellow lawyers and judges. Hence, I would just implore all of you to listen carefully to our panelists this evening. I want you to learn all you can, then use your own critical analysis and other lawyer skill sets to come up with your opinions about tonight's topic. And even though it seems more challenging than ever to engage in constructive dialogue when there are differing points of view, I urge you to nonetheless enter these conversations. And perhaps with a willingness to defend what should be, to my mind, this non-controversial notion that our young people should be taught in a considered and age-appropriate way the whole truth about the history, impact, and persistence of racism in our country. Until this happens, I fear that true and lasting change will remain out of our reach. I want to thank you for joining us this evening. I hope that tonight's panel will better equip you as a lawyer, will better equip you as a parent, if you are a parent of school-age children, and will better equip you as an informed and good citizen of these United States. Now, before we hear from our illustrious panel, we have a special guest. I'm extremely delighted to provide you with the opportunity to hear from the top educator in our city, our very own Chancellor of the New York City Board of Education, David C. Banks. And I'm going to give him a brief introduction. David C. Banks is Chancellor of the New York City Department of Education, the largest school system in the nation. Appointed on January 1st, 2022, he is the former president and CEO of the Eagle Academy Foundation and the founding principal of the Eagle Academy for Young Men, the first school in a network of innovative all-boys public schools in New York City and Newark, New Jersey. He's a lifelong New Yorker, born in Brooklyn, and a proud graduate of New York City Public Schools. After working for a year as a school safety officer, he began his first teaching job at PS 167. From there, he went on to become a founding principal at the Bronx School for Law, Government, and Justice, and later at the Eagle Academy for Young Men. In 2004, Chancellor Banks led the establishment of the first Eagle Academy for Young Men as part of New York City's high school reform initiative in partnership with 100 Black Men, Inc. The Eagle model has since been adopted in schools throughout all New York City boroughs, all 5 of them, and Newark, New Jersey, expanding nationally through the Eagle Institute. Also notable, in 2019, in partnership with Scholastic, David helped curate the Rising Voices Library, a collection of nonfiction, biographical, and fiction books celebrating Black and Latino boys designed to provide students in grades K through 5 with high interest, culturally relevant texts that give context to what they're experiencing in the world around them. Chancellor Banks is a graduate of Rutgers University and received his Juris Doctorate from St. John's University School of Law. In 2003, he participated in the Kahn Fellows Program for Distinguished Principals at the Teachers College, Columbia University. He lives in New York City, has 4 adult children and 3 granddaughters. Everyone, I am so proud to present to you Chancellor David Banks.
Well, oh my goodness, Attorney Sheila Boston, thank you so very much for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to join your moderator and your expert panelists, because I too am anxious to hear this discourse around critical race theory. It's one of the most controversial items, if you will, in our national discourse today. And so I'm going to be very brief and then get out of the way, because I really want to hear from the experts who are really going to provide a level of insight for all of us this evening. I just want to say that I'm a proud, graduate of the New York City Public Schools, but I was also very fortunate because I had Philip and Janice Banks as my parents. And not only did they set high expectations for my brothers and I, but they also ensured that we understood who we are and as young men and as young Black men in this country. We learned quite a bit about our history. And unfortunately, so many of our young people do not get that same level of exposure. And I've been deeply committed throughout my career to helping to expose as many young people to Black history and understanding that we stand on the shoulders of people who fought, bled, died, and sacrificed for us to be where we are. And we owe a debt to our ancestors. As often has been said, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. And with that comes a level of responsibility that we have to our community and to our people. And so even as I come to this place and space, I have committed myself to this body of work. I remember hearing Drew Brees, the former quarterback of the New Orleans Saints, one of the top NFL quarterbacks for many, many years, when he made the statement that he could not take a knee in football as related to the Colin Kaepernick stand. And he said, I couldn't take a knee because my father and my grandfather fought for this country. And in making that statement, the suggestion was that my father and my grandfathers didn't fight for this country. In fact, it was pointed out to him that the first person to die in the American Revolutionary War was a Black man. And his response was, I didn't know that. And how would he know that? Because it is so rare that all Americans are taught the true history of the Black contribution to America. And in fact, America would not be what America is today as this economic superpower were it not for the hundreds of years of free labor that was able to help to build America. And so as the chancellor of the New York City Public Schools, I'm just finishing my second month in office. Be very clear, I'm fully committed to ensuring that all of our children, Black, white, Asian, whatever your background, that we understand the contributions of all of us to the making of America and of this world. It's not a true education if all you've learned is just one perspective. And so I salute all of you for engaging in this conversation. I know critical race theory has a slightly different variation on this. I'm anxious to listen and to hear and to learn myself. But just know that in me, you have somebody who will be a partner in ensuring that we tell the truth about history in America, and the truth will set us free. And all of our young people need to know and hear the truth. And so thank you for even inviting me. Thank you for allowing me to say a few words as you set this off. And I'm going to get out of the way and I'm going to listen to what I'm sure is going to be a very spirited conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chancellor Banks. It was a privilege to have you here. And now, without further ado, let's get on with this panel. But I want to really briefly, because you told me make it brief, introduce our moderator for this evening. She is a phenomenal woman. She's one of my sheroes, Michelle Coleman Mays. She is Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary of the New York Public Library. She joined the New York Public Library in August 2012 after serving as Executive Vice President and General Counsel for Allstate Insurance Company since 2007. This is a woman who is a powerhouse. She has served as senior legal person in all kinds of places, senior legal officer at Pitney Bowes Inc. And she's been at Colgate-Palmolive, and she's been at Burroughs, and the list goes on and on. She's also, I want to note, had served in the U.S. Department of Justice as an assistant U.S. attorney in Detroit and Brooklyn, eventually assuming the role of chief of the civil division in Detroit. I don't think that everybody knows that, Michelle. They should, but just saying. Ms. Mays served on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration under President Obama from 2013 to 14. She was appointed to serve as chair of the Commission on Women in the Profession of the American Bar Association in 2014 to 17. And she's a member of the American Law Institute and what other prestigious organization? None other but the Bar Association of the City of New York. I'm so excited to have her here. If you haven't read her book, she co-authored a book entitled Courageous Counsel, Conversations with Women General Counsel in the Fortune 500. She earned her BA from the University of Michigan and a JD from the University of Michigan Law School. I introduce to some and present to others, none other than the phenomenal Michelle Coleman Mays.
Thank you, Sheila. When you called to ask me to do this panel, I have to admit I was a bit intimidated, but not for long, because when you call, I answer. So I want to thank you for your vision and for spurring and putting together this phenomenal panel. If I did a proper introduction for the panelists this evening, we wouldn't be done till 7 p.m. So they have forgiven me for what I'm going to do, which is a very abridged introduction of this illustrious August group. Professor Tanya K. Hernandez is the Archibald R. Murray Professor of Law at Fordham University School of Law, where she is an Associate Director of the Center on Race, Law, and Justice, and its head of Global and Comparative Law Programs and Initiatives. Dr. Marvin Lin, the Professor of Education and Black Studies at Portland State University in Oregon. a nationally recognized and highly cited scholar. His research critically examines race in schools, the practices of Black male educators, and the best practices for advancing teacher diversity in the United States. Importantly, he is also the lead editor of the recently published Handbook of Critical Race Theory and Education. Kara McClellan is an assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where she works primarily on increasing equitable access to education and ending the criminalization of Black people. I'm going to ask that we have brief remarks. Professor Hernandez, I'd like you to tell us about your journey to becoming a law school professor, including what your areas of expertise are and what types of classes you teach.
Well, when I got out of law school, I became a public interest lawyer and I liked it very much. But one of the refrains I heard quite often from my supervising attorneys was like, oh, you know, Tanya, this product you've written here is interesting and what have you, but this is a motion practice, Hernandez, and we cannot have these long explanations and, you know, social background information of our history of the United States and what have you in this motion. Maybe this is, you know, something you say for a book or some future writing. And what that sort of led me to was, you know, I have this great desire to like teach in writing and to the larger public, and I couldn't do it in public interest practice alone. And so that brought me to pursuing a career in law teaching that enables me to both do some practice and also write without a judge's constraint on my page limitation. The areas that I teach in are critical race theory, employment discrimination, comparative anti-discrimination law, and trusts and wills, amongst other courses. And my primary area of scholarly research are on issues of race, comparative race relations across hemispheres.
Well, I'm glad you found your right balance. We're better for it. Dr. Lin, tell us about your professional journey and how you ended up in academia and what your areas of expertise and interest are.
Thank you. And thank you for having me be part of this important conversation. I have a similar story. I started my life wanting to be an elementary teacher, always wanting to be an elementary teacher from the time I was 8 years old, and did just that. In fact, my first teaching job was in New York City. I was attending Columbia Teachers College and at night, and I taught second grade at a Catholic school in Flushing, Queens, and then I taught third grade at a New York City public school. But what I discovered about the classroom was that I felt that those four walls were a little too enclosed for me. I wanted to be able to, like Professor Hernandez said, to be able to express myself, to be able to think critically, to be able to write, and to sort of analyze and look at what I was seeing. And I had a professor at Columbia College ask me when I was going to get my doctorate, which I had never considered. And so it was when I left there, I made a plan to do a couple more years of teaching and then go into a doctoral program. And so I was fortunate to go to UCLA, where I had the opportunity to work with Professor Crenshaw and Devin Carbato and others. And my professors in education were also situated within this framework as well. And so I went into higher ed in 2001, and I haven't looked back. I've been writing about race, and critical race theory and education has been a key area of interest of mine, and just glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Kara McClellan, you're working at a premier organization, NAACP LDF. What led you to this organization?
Sure, and I also want to say thank you for including me in such an esteemed panel. My path also started with teaching. I graduated from college, and I'm originally from Philadelphia. I graduated from Philadelphia Public Schools, and I returned to Philadelphia to teach middle school. And it was shocking for me going back to the same school district that I had attended but in schools that were 100% low income, 100% Black, incredibly racially and economically isolated, which was different from my experience because I had gone to magnet schools and didn't before that have a full appreciation for how unequally resources were being distributed within the same school system. And so the school where I taught, the kids were talented, hungry to learn, bright, excited, but were receiving secondhand books in a classroom, where the roof was coming down, and where there were often rodents in our room, not conditions that really set students up to excel. And so I really came to understand education as a civil rights issue. And when I went to law school, I was especially interested in continuing to work in education, approaching it as a racial justice issue. And so the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is the organization founded by Thurgood Marshall in 1940. We were the legal arm of the NAACP, and now we often work with the NAACP in litigation and policy work. We work in the areas of education. We argued Brown v. Board, but continue to do other racial equity work. And we also work in the areas of voting rights, criminal justice, and economic justice. So this has been my professional home, and really for me, interning at LDF and then later on working at LDF really crystallized why I went to law school in terms of wanting to work directly on these issues.
So I want to jump right into the meat of our discussion this evening. And to do that, I want to quote from William Faulkner in a book that he authored. And he said, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." So Professor Hernandez, take us to school first few minutes here and tell us about critical race theory. And would you give us concrete examples of how CRT is taught in law school?
I would be happy to. And since I'm taking you to school, here's my PowerPoint slide. It's just a couple, don't worry. I won't beleaguer you all with it. So critical race theory is first developed in law schools. It travels to other colleges and it travels to other disciplines later, but its emergence is within the law school context. It's developed in the late 1970s and 80s by Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, along with many others, to interrogate the conventional legal scholarship framing of equality as rooted solely in two endeavors. This idea that first, it's only about the removal of explicitly racial formal barriers to inclusion, and second, that the disciplining of badly intentioned individuals is paramount. Critical race theory is an analytical frame that goes much deeper than those two ideas of formal equality, in rejecting the facile presumption that the racial disparities that continue to exist today in the absence of white-only signs, in other words, the epitome of what formal law considers equality, that these are now caused by biological or cultural deficits of people of color rather than the structures that they're living in. This is because critical race theory recognizes that racism is embedded in law, policies, and institutions. Let me get you the next slide here. There we go. The CRT mode of analysis, it examines how racism has been a core feature of American history and not the aberration that colorblind legal liberalism treats it as. Accordingly, societal issues like African Americans' higher mortality rate, the outsized exposure to police violence that people of color experience, the school to prison pipeline, the denial of affordable housing, and the rates of the death of Black women in childbirth are not simply viewed as unfortunate and unrelated phenomena. They are instead viewed as the contemporary consequences of racialized policies and practices that have shaped our nation. Now, you may be wondering how critical race theory is different from simply teaching students about our racial history. For instance, a race law class might include the coverage of the Japanese internment as a fact of our history. The critical race theory analytical frame views the Japanese internment not just as a historical fact, but as part of a pattern of racial power that continues today. Similarly, critical race theory's structural focus connects the dots between, for instance, a state's attempt to impose English-only mandates and its anti-Latino subordination. The CRT ability to analyze racism and unearth it in institutions and how it's embedded in law is illustrated by how CRT would analyze the Tulsa, Oklahoma 1921 race massacre from a century ago, because it is an example of how the convergence of law, institutions, and individuals enabled diabolical attacks on American citizens. Examining Tulsa through the prism of the real critical race theory would involve unearthing the conditions that allowed white institutions and leaders of the time to mobilize the law to set a massacre of hundreds in motion and uncovering the long-term consequences. The legal dimensions would include the formal deputizing and arming of white citizens, the rounding up and interning of survivors, and the filing of charges against victims for inciting violence. The massacre's legal aftermath was the failure to indict or prosecute anyone. The massacre's legal backdrop were the segregation laws that corral Blacks into certain neighborhoods and that shored up the economic segregation of professions that then fostered the white resentment of what was called Black-White Wall Street and contributed to the racial disparities in wealth accumulation that exists today. Before I close out this introduction, I want to point out that when I teach this, and my colleagues teach this in the law school context, what I hear back from students is how it unlocks for them a way of understanding law that they didn't otherwise have. I've thrown up on the screen 2 sample student evaluation responses. I won't belabor you with the bad ones. These are the good ones. And the way in which they sort of get to the root of how critical race theory is really about understanding law and history for everyone, not just about those who think they only want to know about minorities, people of color, African Americans. It helps anyone be a good lawyer.
Professor Hernandez, thank you for that brief lecture. It is very informative and really does help us set the stage. I just wanted to get your reaction to something that happened recently and how you would frame it. And what I'm talking about is an incident that occurred in Bridgewater Township, New Jersey, about a week or so ago, where 2 teenagers got into an altercation. And this really goes to how policing is done in this country, which is also a systemic issue. And one teenager was Black, one was white. The Black teenager ended up being handcuffed. The white teenager ended up being shoved onto a couch and basically told to sit still. How would you react to something like that?
Well, what critical race theory sort of would unpack there are the ways in which what is thought to be race neutral law. There's an altercation, police are authorized through our laws to investigate, right? So that looks on its surface as law treats all the same. Critical race theory goes deeper to examine the ways in which how on the ground a race neutral law, altercation, police inquiry authorized by law, is in of itself not an actual race neutral practice. That the racial stereotypes and the presumptions of Blackness as being inherently criminal and suspect, that feeds into how law is actually implemented.
Thank you, because I wanted you to apply it something that was very recent so that we all could relate how you break it down in the real world. Dr. Lynn, Professor Hernandez has talked about what CRT is in a law school academic concept. You are quite involved with this concept. How did you become involved with it?
So I mentioned before that I went to graduate school at UCLA, and I don't know how she does it, but Professor Crenshaw teaches at UCLA and Columbia. So those of us at UCLA also got the benefit of having her as a professor. And then there are other professors there, like I mentioned, Devin Carbato, who served on my dissertation committee, who is also a very distinguished critical race scholar, and Cheryl Harris is there. And UCLA also has one of the only critical race studies programs in the country. It's not a common thing at all. And I was there in the late 90s getting my doctorate in education, and I had the opportunity to take courses in that program, as well as in other departments throughout UCLA. So I got a doctorate that focused on race and ethnic studies in education, and it's a very interdisciplinary degree. And so I took courses in political science, sociology, education, and the law. I was introduced to CRT by my professors who were really using it as a way to situate their work around educational inequality, particularly as it impacts Black and Brown students. At the same time, around the same time that I was going to graduate school, professors Gloria Ladson-Billings and Bill Tate wrote a seminal article in the Teachers College Record called Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education. And they were professors at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is where critical race theorists, when this all began in the early 90s, late 80s, were meeting. And so these folks had relationships with each other. So my mentors in education had relationships with law professors who were, in fact, developing the concept of critical race theory at the time. And so education folks probably started using CRT at its inception, to be quite honest with you, because the first piece was published in 1995. And as a graduate student, I benefited directly from that because my professors were involved in that movement. And I was very interested in trying to understand the experiences of Black students in the classroom, particularly Black males. And a lot of the education theorizing focused on their culture, what they lacked. It focused on their social class issues, but there was very little discussion about race. And so I and many, many others began to see critical race theory as a way to situate our understandings of what was happening, particularly to Black, Brown, and Indigenous children in schools in the US. And it gave us a way to really speak to issues of race and racism as they impact those experiences. So that's how I got involved in critical race theory.
And so if you accept that these wonderful instructors and professors really influenced your thinking and what you wanted to delve into, how did the critical race theory concept move from academia into the political discourse? What do you attribute that to?
Well, I'm going to share with you, and maybe some maps that sort of show you what's going on now, because I think we're going to talk a little bit later about some specific actions that are taking place. But what I can tell you is that what is happening today is a political machination. And I can go through a history of that with you if this is the right time to do that. And I'll share with you a slide that,
Go right
that
ahead.
sort of points that out. Let me see if I can get that on the screen. 1 second here. Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. You have to share your screen, then you have to do the present. Okay, so I'm going to do this first. And then, okay, are you seeing the slide?
Yeah, we
Okay.
are.
So there's the timeline there, right? So in July of 2020, Christopher Rufo, who is a 36-year-old activist from Seattle, received an email describing a professional development training, anti-bias training in the city of Seattle government from a city employee. And he interpreted the trainings as invasive, right, as a form of mind control. And then he published a number of pieces about the trainings, but thought that the terminology of the day lacked the political weight to really capture the threat he perceived. And so he began to refer to these trainings as critical race theory because of something he saw in a byline, or maybe there was a note there that referred to Professor Crenshaw's work in something that he saw. But he hadn't studied or read about critical race theory. And so as far as he was concerned, all the connotations were negative, to middle-class Americans. And he wanted to find a way to capture this entire set of ideas that he found problematic in the teaching around anti-bias. There was a lot of conversation, for example, about white fragility. And all of this was in response to the George Floyd murder, right? George Floyd was heinously murdered before our very eyes. And so this nation had a sort of reckoning around issues of race. And so Christopher Rufo sort of steps into this moment of racial reckoning and decides to do something about it. And so he appears on Tucker Carlson Tonight in 2020, and he described CRT as an existential threat to the United States. He describes it as a threat to core American values. And during that appearance, he also urged President Trump to issue an executive order to abolish CRT. This is in the summer of 2020. So what happens in the fall of 2020, President Trump issues this OMB directive forbidding executive branch agencies from conducting trainings involving the discussion of what he called divisive anti-American propaganda. Since that time, since November and all the way up till now, we have seen a smattering of legislation around the country that's been introduced to prevent the use of CRT in trainings and in education, state government, and in schools. And I'll talk later about specifically where and how that's happening.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to Attorney McClellan and Professor Hernandez. In your opinion, do you think that CRT is being misused? And if so, how? Which one of you want to go first, Kara, and then we'll let the professor go?
Sure, I'll be brief because I know this is really your area of expertise. But what we're seeing is that CRT is really being wrongly conflated with any discussion of race or race consciousness or systemic racism. And as Dr. Lynn was just describing, it's been quite effective in being used as a tool to shut down conversations about inequity, right as our country, was starting to really grapple with racial disparities and systemic racism. And at this point, there are over 17 million students who are going to schools in districts where this kind of manufactured conflict has impacted, what they're learning and their ability to access information. And so the impact on students is real and concrete in terms of their education, but also in terms of their ability to be included, to be valued, to be treated in a way that's dignified within their schools because of the ways that the inequality that they are experiencing or their very identity is being banned from discussion within the school environment. And as Dr. Lynn mentioned, the laws that are being replicated across the country come from this Trump executive order. And a lot of times they actually are a copy paste job in terms of taking that language. We at LDF challenged Trump's executive order in court. And now we're seeing these similar legislations springing up all over the country in terms of the banning of teaching history, of providing trainings to teachers, and in some cases, this very broad language of any type of training, education, or information that makes someone feel uncomfortable because of their race, simply because you're talking about a history of inequity or ongoing discrimination.
And I know we'll look at some maps later on that Dr. Lynn has, but when you talk about these various districts around the country, it feels like whack-a-mole. It's very hard to keep up with the very fast pace of the legislation that is being proposed and passed. So let me turn to Professor Hernandez and get your take on this.
Well, I completely echo everything that Attorney McClellan has just sort of laid out for us. And I would point out that, this is a very well-funded, well-orchestrated endeavor to oppose what is being labeled as critical race theory, but is any attempt to talk about race and now other things too. I mean, this is brought to you by the same people who have brought you book banning, right? Who don't want you to talk about the Holocaust, who don't want you to talk about gender diversity, sexual orientation, and trans identity. And so this is the snowball is a rolling. So what I have up for you up on the screen are some of the numbers, right? We've got at least 16 jurisdictions that have already passed this legislation, and at least another 30 that have it pending. We also have that number increasing on a daily basis. And then if you add to it all the school boards that are entertaining these kinds of restrictions and censoring, it's really quite massive. The sample that I wanted to also point out to you is in Montana. You would think, oh, is this just about making sure Black people don't talk? Well, how many Black people are there in Montana? This is all over, right? It's a national move to silence any kind of redressing, right, of discrimination, or just even have a conversation about it. So, as you can see from on the screen, the sample legislation in Montana, reaches into not just students, but into employees, into assignments, right? Anything that is viewed as we don't want to change the status quo or have a conversation about it. This is a problem not only for students, it's a problem for the teachers. And I won't say out loud the things that are up on the screen, but it's public there. So I thought you should be able to see the way in which teachers are under attack for saying that they'll do critical race theory, or for many, many, many teachers who actually don't do critical race theory in K through 12. They simply are just trying to make their students aware in social studies that there's this thing called Black Lives Matter as a movement, etc. And they are being threatened, they are being harassed, and many of them are being fired. And so this is not a, I guess what I want to say is that we're not here being alarmist. This is a real problem.
One of the things I want to turn to for a minute, Professor, is when you look at the groundswell of opposition to CRT, do you think that those who support it have lost the narrative?
Well, I think that part of the problem is that when this groundswell started, as Dr. Lin sort of laid out the timeline with Rufo ginning up, right, of the opposition, it was viewed by our fellow liberals, right, as, oh, that's just about this little arcane thing in law schools called critical race theory, and not many people do it, and it's just, theory, and so, there's no there. Right? They didn't view it as serious. They didn't envision the ways in which, as so often our history has shown, that the ability to enact issues of subordination start in the groundswell of the space in which Black people live, right? Meaning oppression starts by practicing it out on Black people and the things Black people care about, and then it gets bigger and it implicates others. Right? And so a part of the issue here is that our supporters, not so much that they lost the narrative, but they didn't jump on it soon enough. And now they're trying to play catch up. Now, mind you, I appreciate all the hands on deck that have, started to, wake up and join us. But I think this is part of the dynamic that we have as well. And when I say this is a well-orchestrated and well-funded attack on anything called critical race theory and more, let me give you just a small example. Right? It's a lot of dark money that's hard to trace, but the investigators are out there doing their work too. And what they have found is that just between 2017 and 2019, there was, and I wrote down the number so I wouldn't forget it, here we go, $12.75 million being distributed from the Thomas W. Smith Foundation for the purposes of attacking things called critical race theory and giving parents a script to follow when they go to the school board meetings. So meaning that, it's not sort of an authentic, genuine concern. It's a parroting of words that they have been provided to supplant the public school enterprise. And that the last thing I'll say, a lot of this not only is not brought to you by the people who do book banning, it's also brought to you by the people who do not want to have public school continue as a public enterprise. They want all that money diverted into private school, right? So it's a privatization move along with a anti-mask move. I mean, there's lots of layers to all of this, but it is being performed out on the space of attacking what they're calling critical race theory without being at the least interested in knowing what critical race theory actually is. Christopher Rufo has been very transparent about, he doesn't care what it is actually about. He just likes the label and he sticks the label on anything he wants to attack.
You know, when you talk about book banning, as you can imagine, we are very familiar with that movement in the library. It's been around since time began, but it's very nefarious how it's positioned very often. As though it's an innocent, you know, I'm just trying to protect someone from bad information, and it's never that simple. So, Dr. Lynn, I want to turn to you. We've heard about book banning and about school boards and people being intimidated. Yet, my dear friend, you're on a school board. What possessed you?
Yeah, I was a dean for about a decade, and so that can be a very controversial job too if you've ever had that role. And so I was used to controversy. I was used to being challenged and criticized and all of that. So that none of that was. And I live in a pretty progressive district here in Oregon. In fact, Oregon as a state is pretty progressive in terms of its educational policy. And so we don't have anything close to banning CRT. In fact, we have support for and encouraging the teaching of race in our schools. And my district in particular is very focused on equity. And so I decided to do that as a way to support my community. I have children in the district. I have a graduate of the district. And so I'm a parent. And I felt I could lend something to it. And, you know, it has been challenging, but certainly it has not been overwhelmingly bad. So, and I think the school board is a site of contestation and resistance, right? Somebody mentioned it earlier, that school boards have the power to shape curriculum and policy around these issues, right? And so it's very important that we serve, even with some of we had a group come in 2 weeks ago yelling and screaming about masks, right? And we had to go into a recess and restart our meeting. And so that sort of thing will happen. But I'm grateful to be on the school board with other people who are like-minded, who are concerned about equity and are committed to making sure that we continue to do this important work despite the craziness that's going on. So it's a very important position, and I would encourage people to pursue it because of the power and the authority that you have to determine really the direction of that district and what will be taught and so on. You also have power over teachers' contracts. So if someone wants to restrict somebody from teaching a certain topic, school boards can intervene on that, right? So it's an important role to play.
Well, you know, they talk about politics as local. School boards are very, very local. And one of the things that I've heard is the number of people that have literally been intimidated. So talk about the strategy that you use to blunt intimidation.
Well, part of what I've been doing is participating in conversations like this, just where I try to inform people about the degree to which we are being manipulated. And when we talk about what Rufo has done, if you go to his Twitter page, and I know people say, well, I don't want to give him more attention, but I think it's important to sort of see what he's saying. And he's very clear about his desire to rebrand critical race theory as something that it is not, right? If you go to the Center for Renewing America, they have a whole page that refers to what Professor Hernandez was talking about in terms of giving their electorate tools to combat critical race theory. And one of the things they do is they say, here's a whole set of terms that we believe are the same thing as critical race theory. Things like abolition, critical self-awareness, critical self-reflection, cultural proficiency, cultural relevance, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Equity, and it goes on and on and on, right? Social emotional learning. And so one of the things that's important is to be educated about the strategies that the right is taking up. And they are very organized at multiple levels, at the local level, which is where and how the school boards are being attacked, right? But they're also organized at state level, and they're working, this legislation, as was mentioned, is essentially taken out of Trump's executive order, and it's being put forward by these community groups to these legislators who are approving it in many places. So be informed. I would also say be engaged with your politicians. That's very important. So, I mean, in terms of blunting the impact of this, knowledge is power.
So you mentioned in a conversation we had before the panel began that you actually weren't operating individually, that you had a collection around you of like-minded people, and you used that phrase earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just expound on that just a bit more, how that has helped you maintain your sanity?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate, those of us who study and write about race and education, we are part of a community of scholars and educators, teachers, right? And some of us have gone into administration and some of us have not. But we support each other and we come together periodically to talk about what we are going through and how to support each other through this. I think we also create opportunities for sharing information, such as this one. I have several other panels like this that I'll be serving on over the next few weeks to just get information out there, but to come together with my colleagues to say, how you doing, and how can we support each other, and how can we work together to make sure that the truth is out there about what's really going on. I think that is critical. And also to engage with and connect with community. Every time I have an opportunity to meet with Black parents groups here in Oregon, I do that, right? Sometimes I'm there as a speaker, sometimes I'm just there as a parent. I'm also very connected to my church and my religious organization, and I participate in that. So that spiritual development and nurturance is also key and important. So I think all of that and more, I think we have to keep doing.
It's one of the things that President Boston mentioned at the outset about the pillars of the city bar and focusing on mental health, which sometimes we take as it's a nice to do, but not that critical. And I think that is way short-sighted. Cara, I want to turn to you because I feel like I got so smart today because I'm surrounded by all these teachers, past or present. But you were a teacher in the Philadelphia Public School, as you previously mentioned, but now you're advocating for students. You've taken on a different role using a different tool. What, in your opinion, are the consequences for students who are living through this moment of hell, if you will, with adults not acting like adults and they're trying to just get their education?
Yeah, I think that says it. They're just trying to get their education. They're just trying to access information. And all young people deserve to receive an education where they can freely learn and talk about history, the diverse experiences and viewpoints of the people who make up this country. So I think, for example, about the advocacy we're doing in Southlake, Texas, in response to SB 3, which is one of the anti-CRT legislations that sprung up. And one of the students that we represent there talks about how she was in class and they were discussing historical segregation in schools. And she asked a question about, whether Black students had to be bused more, or she wanted to understand more of what was happening historically. And the teacher said, sorry, I can't answer that because of SB 3. That's where we are in terms of students wanting to learn and to know, and educators being prohibited from talking and answering these questions and doing what they're there to do, to educate.
So it's a form of censorship when you come down?
It's a form of censorship, but it also sends a particular message to students who come from backgrounds where their background is being censored, or their particular history or the ongoing discrimination that their communities are experiencing is what's being censored, right? So if we think even about the, as it's being called colloquially, don't say gay law in Florida, you could make an abstract argument that that's not actually taking a position, but it is. It's suggesting to students, we can't even talk about who you are. And so for students, they take away the message, well, I must be bad. There must be something bad about my identity if we can't even talk about it, if we can't even talk about who I am or about my history. And so we're seeing this prioritization of certain students' feelings over other students' fundamental well-being, right? This idea that if we talk about race or racism, or if we talk about being gay or being lesbian, that might make somebody feel uncomfortable, but it's at the expense of students who come from these backgrounds literally being able to be acknowledged and recognized and feel dignified in schools. And the impact is really creating an environment that is not, that is exclusive and that is not educating everybody. And the research is very clear that when you have an inclusive, culturally responsive education, it benefits all students, but it also is a buffer against future discrimination because students and staff are more well-educated and are able, therefore, to better ensure that they're not actually engaging in discrimination or creating a hostile environment in the school.
You know, I wonder, this is beyond the scope of this panel, but when you look at the suicide rates for teenagers, I wonder how this entire environment exacerbates that if I'm denying your right to exist as you are.
And just to be clear, there has been some research about that, and particularly in the districts where these types of don't stay gay or anti-trans legislation are being passed in terms of how that is connected to rising suicide rates for students from those backgrounds.
I'm going to keep you on the hook for a minute because you're also litigating some of these cases in the legislation. Can you just share with the audience what you've been doing in Texas and various locations?
Sure. So in Southlake, Texas, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, along with Arnold and Porter, and I have to shout out Sheila, my co-counsel on this case, where we represent students and families in Southlake, Texas. It's not in litigation in court, but rather it's an administrative complaint that we filed with the Department of Education. And we are arguing in the complaint that there are violations under Title VI, which prohibits discrimination based on race, and Title IX, which prohibits discrimination based on sex. And that what's happened in Southlake, and Southlake isn't the only place that it's happened, but it is an especially concerning set of circumstances. Where there was a hostile environment that existed within the district. That students, first of all, there were 2 different incidents where students were caught on video chanting the N-word, and the district was on notice that there was a racially hostile environment. Parents and students came out and shared their testimonies of having experienced harassment. And as a commission further studied this, it became clear that it wasn't only harassment based on race, it was also harassment of students who identified as gay, harassment of students who identify as non-binary, just a hostile environment on many dimensions in the district. And rather than act to address this, the district took no action. And instead, this is the same place where after SB 3 passed, we hear an administrator instructing staff, well, if you're going to teach about the Holocaust, you have to teach both sides of the Holocaust. And where a teacher was actually punished because a child came home with a book that was called "This Book is Anti-Racist." So what we're seeing is that in the places where the type of inclusive education and access to materials that would serve as a buffer against discrimination is most needed, districts are acting to do the opposite, to reduce access to those materials that would really make a real difference. And in the meantime, our clients who are parents and students who have endured in this environment for years, right? We represent one student in particular who was called the N-word at school at least once a year for over 3 years. His mom repeatedly went to the district and they did nothing. And so, these types of hostile environment, Title VI and Title IX violations, school districts have a duty to address. But when there are so-called anti-CRT legislations or book bans that are preventing districts from doing what anti-discrimination law requires them to do, ultimately federal law is what controls. The Constitution is what controls, and districts have to address the discrimination that is illegal and that they're on notice that they need to correct for.
So I just want to make just one observation, being a former litigator myself way back when. That's a long road. It's nothing that is typically instantaneous. And so how do you factor in that these individuals are in high school for only a limited period of time? And the case could go on for years. I know you're saying it's at the administrative stage, but even if you get to court, it just isn't a fast track as a rule. So how do you mesh my need as an individual for relief today with a strategy that doesn't act that rapid?
Well, I'm continually impressed by the advocacy that folks on the ground are doing in their local communities. They may not be able to, immediately get an injunction preventing the law from going into effect, but they can, through organizing, influence people and try to win the battle of hearts and minds, which ultimately, the law can only do so much. What we need is to really educate people about the real concrete harms that are going on in their school districts. And a mother can identify with that. A father can identify with that, regardless of their background. This idea that a student is experiencing severe harassment that is causing them to not want to come to school, or to, in some cases, not even want to live. That's something, regardless of your background, you should be able to empathize with and want to create change about. And so I think it's about educating people that this isn't just a theoretical conversation about CRT, but it is a really concrete conversation about the harms our students are experiencing that are real and that are impacting their ability to access their education.
So Dr. Lynn, I want to turn to the handbook that you helped bring to fruition on CRT and education. How does that help with what's occurring at the moment?
Well, thank you. The handbook was initially published in 2013 when President Obama was in office, and we were talking at that time about the concerns we had about this idea that we were somehow in a post-racial moment. And
yeah,
so,
right.
We were having a whole conversation around that. And the second edition of the handbook came out in November of 2021. And so we got a chance to really take another look at what we were doing and resituate it within the context of January 6th and this ongoing effort to ban race, the teaching of race from K-12 schools as well as from higher education. And so we're situating it now within that. But it really highlights some of the research of some of the best, most prolific education scholars in our field who are using critical race theory as a framework to try to look at a variety of areas. So we have scholars who study higher education, and they're very interested, for example, in the whole struggle right now over affirmative action, right? And the whole history behind sort of how we got here. And they're talking about the benefits of affirmative action and sort of what they see happening if we are to lose it. There's another group of scholars who are studying K-12 classrooms and what happens in my work. And for example, I use critical race theory as a lens to look at the work of teachers who are interested in ensuring that Black kids not only learn to read, but also learn to think critically and to use their agency as a transformative tool, right? And so we have a variety of studies that look across the field of education, and there's so many different aspects, but that are very interested in how race and racism shape outcomes. Because as I said before, we didn't have a lot of information about that, and there weren't really tools in our field to help us do that. So the handbook brings together a collection of about 50 scholars from across our field, and a couple of law scholars. Richard Delgado has a chapter, Kevin Banks has a chapter, there's a law scholar, there's a couple of sociologists who are really, I think, on the leading edge of helping us think about the relationship between race, racism, and education. So we're excited about this work.
It sounds like it's a wonderful update of something that is sorely needed. I didn't ask you guys this question when we got together briefly the other day, but I figure it's fair game, and besides I'm the moderator. How much do you think this movement that's anti-CRT was exacerbated by COVID and then digitization. I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that. Did parents all of a sudden wake up when their kids were on their laptop and say, you're learning what? Or was it something more nefarious going on? I'm just curious. Anyone want to jump in? I'm not going to call it whoever, because since I didn't discuss it, Professor, Doctor, Attorney McClellan, anyone will do.
Well, the only thing I'll say, and I think probably Professor Hernandez can talk about this more in terms of the idea in critical race theory of progress and retrenchment, right? That we were seeing some progress. It's not exactly connected to the pandemic, although I do think pandemic raised in people's mind an increased understanding of systemic racism and how that related to other types of disparities. But post the murder of George Floyd, when people were all at home, I think, and really getting access to much more coverage of systemic racism, I think that led to some of the attempts to, both look at the data, but also try to take some steps to address it. And what we're seeing is a direct response to that movement, that forward movement, to try to stop that progress from happening in a really politically charged way, using this kind of tool, this new term of CRT to push back against it. And when we think about the places that have become battlegrounds around CRT, it's really, it's in districts where there is increasing diversity, right? It's a lot of districts that are suburban areas surrounding urban areas where there's been an increase in Black or Latino or other people of color moving to these areas, or it's been in places that are political battlegrounds. And so I think that just goes to show that this often is about a response to progress happening in particular places, and in a way of trying to push back against that progress.
Anyone else want to chime in? Doctor, Professor?
I mean, I would just add that the very same way that the pandemic and the shutdown exacerbated our reactions to the murder of George Floyd, I think because we're all like sort of trapped at home watching it all take place up on the screen, and we're watching many screens all at the same time. I think it also exacerbated the resistance to the idea of changing of the status quo, right? And so when Attorney McClellan points out that these battlegrounds are not sort of random, right? The timing of it also isn't random. So that is to say, what we're calling the racial reckoning, right? Just as all these institutions, I'm in educational institutions, are doing their racial audit studies, they're doing climate survey studies, and we're just at the point of, okay, we've done the studies, we've done the survey questions, we figured out how people are feeling about things. Now, let's start making some institutional changes.
Right.
Like meaning, do the CRT move, making a systemic change. That's when you see a real lighting up of what's being called the anti-CRT sort of opposition movement. Right? When we're trying to make change a reality, we're not just doing surveys any longer.
And I'll just add that, the same people who are upset about CRT and the teaching of CRT in the schools, which we know for the most part that isn't happening, but that's at least what people are being led to believe, are also upset about masks, right? And so there is this, what I hear as a school board member is that people have this anxiety and this frustration about being told what to do and being having their behavior be controlled. No, I'm not wearing a mask, and no, I'm not learning about race, right? And so these things go hand in hand. So I would venture to say that if we weren't in a pandemic, maybe there would be less fervor around the whole CRT thing. But I think, the right was very opportunistic, right? In terms of, you have a population of people who are frustrated about and feeling like they're being controlled. You can also get them to be very, very reactionary around issues of race.
One of the things I just wanted to ask you about, again, this is going off the grid, but you guys are smart, is one of the things I talk about instead of using the word privilege is cumulative advantage. And I'd like you to talk about how, if you can, how World War II veterans who came back under the VA bill, the GI Bill, and how acquiring housing and how you would look at that through a CRT prism. I think that would be really instructive. So who wants to tackle that?
I mean, the very succinct, short version of that is looking at all the ways in which government benefits, right,
Yeah,
were allocated for those returning veterans. Some would say affirmative action, but anyway, government benefits are being allocated to them at the same time that we have a building out of suburban communities and a access to government funding for mortgages and building that is all racially restrictive. You know, what we
right.
call redlining is born through government allocation zones and restriction, so that the accumulation of wealth, right, racially bounded, right, is directly tied to the government involvement. And so it's not sort of, oh, we worked hard and this happened, right? It's that, oh, the government set it up so that certain populations, white, right, were able to, you know, move on up, have mobility, etc., in ways that were not made available to many others. If I
Exactly.
may,
Go ahead.
the one thing that I think sometimes people find useful is like they get a little sort of overwhelmed by this idea of sort of what's systemic, what's structural, and particularly when it comes to race. Somehow race seems both hyper visible and invisible all at the same time. So an example that I like to use to sort of talk about systemic problems is to think about this for the moment from the world of someone who's in a wheelchair, right? Or has other forms of disability, right? But let's stick with the wheelchair for a moment. There's lots of data that will let you know that those who are disabled, right, or differently abled, right, are not able to access the labor market, right, are not able to have social mobility in the ways that many of our other members of our population are. One way to explain that would be about their deficits, right? Oh, well, they can't do this and they're not smart enough, right? Meaning those are the individualistic kinds of ways that our society explains someone's individual inability to sort of move on up. A systemic approach would look at the ways in which someone in a wheelchair has a very difficult time navigating, right, getting to and from a job, getting to and from a job interview, but meaning that the way in which our built environment, right, is set up in many places, there are no ramps in much of the country, right? That this is a way in which systemically, structurally, right, we limit the participation, right, of those who are wheelchair bound in our labor market. So that vision of, oh, it's not about the individual failings, it's about the ways in which we systemically and structurally set up, right, access in a society that limits, right, and creates barriers that I think if you can sort of seeing that, right, through sort of what seems a more accessible analogy of like the wheelchair bound person, I think better helps situate this idea about the ways in which systemic and structural barriers along race lines sort of are these invisible, but at the same time impenetrable barriers for many people in our society based on race.
It's funny you should use the example of someone who is confined to a wheelchair in order to navigate whatever world they choose to exist in. And I had a panelist a couple years ago who had a progressive form of, well, it's MS, multiple sclerosis. And so she didn't start out in a wheelchair by any stretch of the imagination. She was a practicing lawyer in the courtroom. She said the minute she became wheelchair bound, she finally realized that for once she could say being a woman was less of a problem than being in a wheelchair. People would yell at her. She couldn't hold a conference with the judge to do a sidebar because the bench was so high and he's looking down trying to decide what to do with her. And so it was just very interesting, and it just really underscores the point you're trying to make. So I want to end on this note. before opening up to any questions. President Boston has talked about that she's nicknamed the City Bar the Bar of Hope. And therefore, the title of this program is one where she wants to impart optimism. To that end, what can lawyers do to help prevent this dissemination of misinformation? Today, we're focusing on CRT. Tomorrow, it may be something else. But if you were to impart what you think we can do as a profession, what would you tell the audience? Dr. Lynn, do you want to start?
Well, being the non-lawyer on the panel,
We forgive you.
Hope would, right. My hope would be that they would get involved in some of these legislative efforts that some of which Kara is describing and others. I think there's so much.
Okay, so show your maps. You need to show your maps for a minute. You
Okay,
didn't show your maps.
Yeah, and I'm gonna try to make sure my notes don't show up at the same time. So thanks for letting me know about that. All right, let me see if I can do that this time.
Because when you talk about the legislative effort, those maps really dramatize what you're talking about.
Yeah, I have let's see here. All right, let me play. All right. So yes, this map it shows the efforts that are going on in 36 states to restrict education. So you see that from Alaska all the way to Florida, right? So there's some kind of legislation has been introduced, okay? And the red dots represent that. All right. And then this is a map from last year, right? So where laws had only been passed at that point in 3 states for higher education. And then in other states, you see that in the yellow, laws have been passed that also specified higher education. Now this is January 22. And so you see a lot more activity going on where there are laws that have been passed that specify higher education. It's still limited to 3, but many more are either pending or already passed in the K-12 context.
Okay, thank you very much. You got more?
Yeah, one more.
Yeah.
And so this is a map that the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education is using as a way to give people a sense of, again, the legislative efforts, right, and to bring forth anti-CRT, remember, it's not just about race, it's also banning the teaching of around patriarchy as well. It's also like in Florida, it was mentioned, you can't say gay, right? And so it's connected to a lot of different progressive movements on the left that are not just related to things that would be historically considered CRT. But so yeah, we need attorneys to get involved in helping to fight some of this and to represent individuals, I think, who want to challenge it.
And what else, Kara, Professor, what else would you say we need to do besides get involved?
Okay. Or Kara, you want to go first? Oh, okay. I can do it very quickly. I would say, please go to the African American Policy Forum page. I've got it listed for you there up on the screen. I will also put a link in the chat. They are organizing and giving you directives on sort of how you can get involved. I'm just scrolling through the page so you can see. What can you do? There's lots of things to do. Go to the site, pick one. And I'll put it in the screen, the chat for you right now.
Thank you. Kara, anything you want to add?
I just think President Boston, I completely agree that we as lawyers who, it's in the legal education context that CRT comes from. So I think speaking honestly about what CRT is and isn't and educating people about that is on us. And then I also think, and this is, I think, a point that was made earlier, but because litigation is going to take a long time, being involved in the legislation is really important at the stage before it passes. And so I think that's a place where lawyers can play a role. It's incredible to think that there is legislation passing in this many states that pretty clearly violates the Constitution in some cases. And so, I think it's not necessarily that the people passing the law don't think that there's real First Amendment or 14th Amendment implications, but rather that they know it's going to take a long time for the actual challenge to play out. And so, given that that does take a while, I think it's especially important for lawyers to get involved on the front end in terms of designing legislation or preventing unconstitutional legislation from going into effect in the first place.
Well, you three have done many things, and one of the things you've done this evening so well is to communicate. And that's to really educate people so there is willful awareness by this audience. And so kudos to the audience for joining us to make sure that they became more aware of what CRT is and what it isn't. And I just want to end before going to the questions with a quote from Professor Clint Smith from the book, How the Word is Passed. And this is a deeply researched and transporting exploration of the legacy of slavery and its imprint on centuries of American history. And he made this comment toward the end of the book. It was as a teacher, you guys can relate to this, that I first became to fully account for the way the history of this country shaped the landscape of my students' communities, from Jim Crow apartheid to mass criminalization and beyond. I have come to realize that those conversations with my students, now a decade ago, about how we might begin to understand our lives in relation to the world around us, were some of the earliest sparks for this book. And so I thank you for the sparks that you generated this evening. I am most appreciative and hope you continue the good fight. So do we have any questions that we need to turn to now from the audience? So I'm giving you all a virtual applause, just so you know. So this is from an anonymous attendee, it doesn't matter. With the fact that critical race theory is actually a graduate course, why isn't more talk geared into combating the lies surrounding those who basically don't want to hear about the truth, learn about the truth, and start dispelling the lies about the history that is being forced onto society in public and private schools? Did that question make sense? Can you see it?
This is Tanya. I can see it. And I think in part, and then I'll let others chime in, is that when you engage in oh, you all are misinformed, they're not really teaching critical race theory in K through 12, you end up in this very circular context where you're not really piercing at what the real battlefield is. That is to say, they don't care that it's not really critical race theory. You don't convince anybody by saying, that's not really critical race theory. Critical race theory is this, right? Because it's just a label. And what the label is, they're sort of kind of covering up, is that they don't want the 1619 Project book taught. They don't want to hear about gay and lesbian identity formation. Right? They don't want to hear about any kind of details of sort of multiple perspectives on history. Right? And so, because that's the real issue and that's the real concern, you don't really readily address it by being factually specific, but not at all getting to the heart of what the real, the resentment against changing the status quo and having a social transformation is part of what is the heart of what is going on here. And so you don't really get at that by simply saying, oh, you're misinformed. This is not really critical race theory. I mean, and I would just say that I wish it were being taught in K through 12. I've got plenty of feedback from other people who tell me like when they do expose young people to it, it is both illuminating for them and empowering because they have a language and a grammar, right, for processing the racial disparities they see around them. And they have a way to be able to explain it as something other than just cultural or personal failings, deficits, or inherent lack of intellectual skill sets. So I think I've said more than you asked, but that's my 2 cents.
Well, actually, I think it was about $1's worth, but we appreciate it. So there's one last question we'll turn to before ending the program, and it's from Barbara Hoffman. She says, I was a law professor in 1978 involved in critical legal studies out of Harvard by Duncan Kennedy. Derek Bell, in some of those years, was dean at the University of Wisconsin and a participant. I think critical race theory was a derivative that criticized the law as neutral. Don't you think that the critics of the theory, in fact, is that it left the ivory tower? I think it is interesting that nobody went past 1990s in the history of its source. Dr. Lynn, you want to do that one?
Well, sure, and I'm sure Tanya can speak better to this than I can, but absolutely, from what I understand, the folks who gathered in Madison, Wisconsin in the late 80s and 90s to create critical race theory did so out of their frustration with the critical legal studies field. And they were active participants in those meetings and in those conferences, but the issue of race was what epiphenomenized, right? Marxists tend to talk about race as a symptom of a larger force, right? And that was not suitable. That was not acceptable to critical scholars of the law who were Black, Brown, and Indigenous. And it was the same thing for education scholars, right? To say that, you have racism because of classism or because of sexism, it's just not acceptable. So we needed another way to talk about race. But absolutely, I think when you read histories of critical race theory, there's always talk about critical legal studies as a field and how it influenced the thinking and the focus on neutrality and objectivity and the myth of the meritocracy and all those things. So that's also part of the foundation of the field. Absolutely.
I would simply add that I wouldn't characterize it as derivative. I would instead say that it was in conversation with critical legal studies, but turned to a different focus. And that part of that turn to the different focus on issues of race was also a frustration with the ways in which critical legal studies had a very deeply rooted critique of rights. Right? This idea that, thinking about rights was an empty promise, that it was all about politics. Right? And while critical race theory is built by a varied, a number of perspectives of different scholars, some of who focus on issues of politics. But a key part of our racial history is that even where law looks like it's an empty promise, sometimes that's the only thing we were able to hold on to and to rely on as far as moving the needle forward with regards to issues of equality. Or as Patricia Williams says, another foremother, right, of critical race studies, that we breathe life into the Constitution to make it an equality-based Constitution, right? Our blood, sweat, and tears. And so that was not something that critical legal studies wanted to attend to, think about. Right? They had a different set of priorities. They were not our set of priorities. So a few extra words about why I would just problematize that language of derivative.
So I want to thank you again for your expertise and your insights, and I'm going to turn the floor over to President Boston.
Thank you so much. I first want to give Carrie Ann Wright. She is the program chair for this event. I wanted to give her a chance to give her shout outs, and then I will give concluding remarks. Carrie Ann?
Hi, everyone. That was fantastic and illuminating. I appreciate everyone's energy, from the moderator to our amazing panelists. So on behalf of the Education and the Law Committee, I'd really like to thank everyone who showed up tonight to listen into this amazing presentation, particularly our chairperson, Jarian James, and a special thank you to Kendall Argrett, who helped with identifying panelists, and with Samantha Brenner and Zareen Ghaznavi, who helped with an important article that was shared on the City Bar's website. So thank you, everyone, and I'll pass it to you, President Boston.
Thank you so much, Carrie Ann. So very quickly, I did see one question in the chat that I want to address. Someone asked, well, why didn't we have a racially diverse panel? And I'll be quite frank with you. Originally, I had planned for a racially diverse panel, and I did extend an offer to 2 people, but because of conflicts, they were not able to attend and participate this evening. And as things came together, in the end, I was like, well, I have an all people of color panel here. And I thought about it and I said, you know what? This is Black History Month. We are saluting and celebrating the accomplishments, the expertise, the brilliance, and the talent of Black people. And so I thought it not robbery to go forward with this illustrious panel and a wonderful moderator. So I hope that you agree with me that it was a brilliant and wonderful panel this evening. I know I learned a lot more, thought I knew a lot, but I've learned even more. My heart is full. The vision I had has come to fruition, and I just couldn't be happier. So thank you to the Education and the Law Committee. Carrie Ann already gave out my specific shout outs to Samantha, Zareen, and Kendall Ruth. I also want to thank James Lewis, the Executive Director of the City Bar's Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and I call them my City Bar gang, Mary Onuma Margulis, Maria Salenti, Eric Friedman, Martha Harris, and Kevin Maguip, who is our IT guru. And finally, 1,000 expressions of gratitude to our phenomenal moderator, Michelle Coleman Mays. You did a marvelous job. Thank you to our special guest, Chancellor David C. Banks, and of course, to the stellar panelists, Dr. Marvin Lin, Professor Tanya Hernandez, and attorney Kara McClellan. I wish peace and blessings to you all. I'm excited about continuing on in the fight, the struggle, and as John Lewis would say, getting into some good trouble. So I hope you learned a lot. Now go forth and remember to be the change that you want to see in the world. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a good night.